welcome to the Base podcast. Today, we're very excited to be speaking with Alex Petkas. Alex is a former classics scholar turned media entrepreneur. He has a PhD in classics from Princeton University, and he taught classics at the universities of California, San Diego, California State University, Fresno, and he has recently started a school in rhetoric. They run retreats and all sorts of exciting events. He's principally known to us as the host of a wonderful podcast, The Cost of Glory, which is an incredibly accessible guide to the ancient world, which, as well as being accessible and informative, is wonderfully produced and seamless and evocative. And we thought that we would talk about Plutarch. Now, certainly I didn't know anything really about Plutarch prior to this. All I knew was that he was the source material for some of Shakespeare's histories. So we're very much like in the dark here, Alex. I wonder if you could just start by sketching out a little bit about who Plutarch was and how he came to write these biographies that Shakespeare later used.
Yeah, Plutarch is an interesting figure for today because he is not that well known, even among people who consider themselves to be classically educated. He's not a very prominent in curricula, in high school or even in university programs, and it's funny because he was one of the most popular classical writers for many centuries of the early modern period up through at least the mid 19th century. For example, in the American colonies, he is the classical author best represented on the bookshelves of American, uh, you know, colonialists. And that has a lot to do, and his decline is kind of another story. I think it has a lot to do with the rise of scientific history and the German model of university and Wissenschaft. And, he kind of gets sidelined for other historians like Thucydides, Herodotus, Polybius. But Plutarch is an ancient philosopher, first and foremost, who wrote most notably a collection of biographies. There's 48 or so biographies of the most famous Greeks and Romans that in most cases sort of set the tone for what the rest of history thought of some of the greatest figures from antiquity. He's writing in the reign of maybe Trajan and Nerva, so he's late first century AD, and all of his characters are from the Roman Republic and earlier. So he's not writing about. He does have a couple of biographies of emperors, but he kind of ends the story with Mark Antony. But it begins with the early founders of the Greek city-states and Rome as well, and the 8th and 7th century BC, people like Solon, Numa, Romulus, Lycurgus of Sparta, and he kind of goes down in an almost unbroken chain of that chronologically. He just covers all the major figures with a couple of interesting exceptions. From the founding of the great city-states of antiquity, Athens, Sparta, and Rome, all the way to the fall of the Roman Republic, most famously the death of Julius Caesar, the war between Antony and Cleopatra, right? That's where he comes in as an inspiration for Shakespeare. But his purpose in writing biography was, as a philosopher, to shape the moral character of his readers. And he makes this very explicit. And indeed, the majority of Plutarch's surviving writings are actually not the biographies. He's an immensely copious classical author. There's 15 or so volumes of the Loeb series with his works in them. Moral essays, kind of philosophical speculations, dialogues. The biographies are the best, I think, the most worth. It's all worth reading, but the biographies are the real classics, and they're a real achievement because he manages to put the characters of these men in loving and not uncritical detail, in a such a compelling way that really shows you who they are and gets you a feel for what lives these men led and what their strengths and weaknesses were, telling anecdotes, um, and their great achievements and failures, while remaining very entertaining, but also with a light touch that kind of calls you to emulate their virtues and avoid their vices. And so it's been a inspiration for generations of leaders throughout the West, up through the 20th century, but especially in up to the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, he was a very popular author in the Renaissance, and it's no surprise that Shakespeare would turn to him as not just a window into the characters of men he was interested in portraying, Coriolanus, um, Julius Caesar, Cassius, but also as as a model for a storyteller, because Plutarch really does have a dramatic sense. He's not like a top, you know, S tier, as they say, historian per se. He's a great historian, but he's a little bit below a Polybius or Thucydides in terms of his analysis of politics. That's not really his goal, and he says this explicitly. In the life of Alexander, he has this great preface. If you want to kind of get into his historical method, he says, "I'm not going to catalog all the wars and all the political deeds of Alexander nor Caesar, um, but my goal is to reveal the character and, as it were, the image of the soul of a man, which is sometimes revealed in a chance jest or an offhand remark, as much as it would be in the sacking of dozens of cities." So, his goal is really so in that he's not the top historian, but he is really um, in the company of the Olympians when it comes to his storytelling ability in prose. So I think that's why he was so influential on the literature of Europe in general and Shakespeare in particular. And well, I'll stop there and we can move on to go into. I can keep going on Plutarch endlessly. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
question? So when exactly, Alex, is Plutarch writing?
He starts the biographies 70, 80 AD, I think.
Right.
I could have that right. And it continues through, 110 or so. So he's a rough contemporary of um, Luke, the gospel writer. He's a little later than St. Paul, a generation or so after Seneca, a generation or so before Marcus Aurelius. So to kind of pin him
Mm.
to some more familiar authors.
Yeah, that's very useful. And he's Greek, but
Hmm.
he's Greek, and he's writing the parallel. So he writes these stories, kind of the parallel lives, and he
Hmm.
were they originally published? You'd read them together, but these days they're sort of separate. They've been separated at some point. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and this is an important part. The name of the collection is The Parallel Lives, which means the lives next to each other in Greek. And he paired them. He wrote them in couplets, pairing a Greek and a Roman with each other. The Caesar and Alexander, Pericles and Fabius Maximus, the man who first defeated Hannibal, uh, Romulus and Theseus, Numa and so on and on. Uh, because I think this is an interesting conceit because comparing the Greek and the Roman, on the one hand, it is part of his cultural project, which as he's a Greek living in Greece, he's a priest in later life at the shrine of Delphi, where the oracle is. So he's a not insignificant figure in kind of civic life, and he's a public figure in his day, and he's not a tip-top, Roman senator. And he's living in this period of the Pax Romana. So Greece is under the domination of Rome at the time, and he's writing in Greek, but most of the Roman upper class are going to be able to read Greek. And he's writing to help the Greeks appreciate the Romans and to help the Romans appreciate the Greeks, which is part of why I think he pairs them together to help them. And the way that I think you come to really appreciate a culture from the perspective of Plutarch is to understand its heroes. Who are the men or the figures that a culture looks to as the kind of landmarks of greatness, and that will help you really get into the soul of a culture. If you want to study the Iranians, it couldn't hurt to study Cyrus the Great, and so on. And so there's that cultural project on the one hand that is served by doing this parallel lives conceit, but the other is a moral philosophy conceit. I call him a philosopher. He's and he does engage in the occasional cosmic speculation and talk about the Plato's forms and so forth. But really, at heart, he's a shaper of morals, and the parallel life structure, I think, encourages you to compare yourself with these men. It kind of invites the kind of comparison of greatness, and that's just intimately connected with what this whole project is about, which is, as he says in the life of, and I'll read you a passage here from the beginning of the life of Aemilius Paulus, a great Roman figure. He says, "I began writing my lives for the sake of others, but I find that I am continuing the work and delighting in it now for my own sake also, using history as a mirror," key phrase there, "and endeavoring in a manner to fashion and adorn my life in conformity with the virtues therein depicted." And he goes on to talk about how nice it is to kind of invite these men into his living room and sit with them and watch the way they drink their wine and stuff, imaginatively. But when you look into history as a mirror, you see yourself in it, and then you can see your flaws in it, and you can kind of adjust your hair or whatever needs to be adjusted. But it's about seeing yourself in these figures as well, and that comparison structure kind of serves that end
Yeah.
very nicely.
So he's how far away in time is he writing about these people? Like he
Yeah,
doesn't know any of these people,
yeah,
obviously.
this is important actually because so Antony dies in 31 BC. So a good more than 100 years, or about 100 years, separates them. And it kind of relates to the way in Tacitus, writing in the reign of Trajan, the good years, the good emperors, he's writing his Annales, the history of the first emperors, beginning with Tiberius, eh, looking back with enough distance that he can write, as he says, sine ira et studio, without anger or partisanship. And that's very much true of Plutarch. In Plutarch's day, the Julius Caesar was arguably a controversial figure, but he had been, dead long enough because, Caesar ended the Republic. And there's a lot of men, certainly in Seneca's generation, in the 50s, there's this conspiracy against Nero. These men who conspired to murder Nero took Cato the Younger as their kind of rallying cry. There are people who kind of want to bring the Republic back for several decades after the empire is established, and or at least challenge the autocracy. So having a little distance there is probably a feature rather than a bug for Plutarch. He also sees I think that, history could be said to have ended in some way from the perspective of Plutarch when Augustus founded the empire. At least, the time of the free city-states that were warring amongst themselves. There's something that has been lost, even though I don't think he says that explicitly anywhere. So, but it also has you know, the feature that he's drawing all of this from literary sources, essentially. So there's no eyewitnesses alive, much less himself, of any of this stuff. Although he does travel to Rome, he does learn Latin, so he's using Livy, the Roman historian, as a source for a lot of these campaigns. And he's a good researcher, but he's not the kind of guy that Thucydides was, who actually was a general in the war that he's describing, and Polybius himself. And you can say this about many of, Xenophon. A lot of the classic mold of the ancient historian per se is they're a participant in the event. Sallust is a participant in to some extent in the politics of the Roman Republic that he's writing about. But Plutarch as a biographer maybe has an out in that regard. But he is, and he'll tell you what his sources are often, but they are all, much earlier.
And is he, has word of Christ got anywhere near Plutarch?
Not in a traceable way. Um, he's not, they're not mentioned anywhere. Uh, I believe the first literary reference to the Christians is in Pliny, who's a contemporary of Plutarch, but we don't see it in Plutarch. But he is a monotheist. He's a Platonist philosopher, and he's a Platonist, and the Platonists in his day were, excuse me, the Platonists in his day were sympathetic to Aristotle as well. So he kind of harmonizes Plato and Aristotle in a lot of ways. And, you know, Plato was very interested in mimesis and the power of storytelling to affect and shape character and the education of the youth. Talks about this at length in the Republic. And in some way, you can see Plutarch as, his project as inspired by the Republic to do a good version of what Plato was criticizing the poets for doing, heroes quarreling, gods quarreling, and crying and all this stuff. But so even though he's not a Christian, or he's not, he doesn't mention Christ, he is taken up as a model author by later Christians. So there's a famous, well, it's not that famous, I guess. To me, it's famous. A poem from the 11th century of a Greek poem by a monk or a bishop or something who prays for the soul of Plutarch and Plato. They were so close, Lord, if you could just spare them the flames, because they shaped our morals, and they were so close to having a true conception of the one true God. And so he's been a sympathetic figure in Christianity for a long time. Basil the Great references some biographies of Plutarch and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
And so with where is Plutarch sourcing his history from? Like, is he going to the library in Alexandria? Where is he? How is he finding all this information out about these characters, and how much of it is he making up or
Mhm.
embellishing? And has that had an effect on him in history and his validity?
Yeah, it's a good question. You probably have to look at it to answer the question fully on a case by case basis, because the sources are so different for so many of these figures. The sources for the life of Pericles, for example, he's looking at a lot of Greek plays, Greek comedies that mention Pericles and make fun of him for having a funny shaped head, and he's uh, so in Boeotia, where he lives, he's within a day or two journey from Athens, which is still a great center of learning. There'll be a lot of libraries there. As a wealthy, upstanding upperclassman in his little town, he would had enough wealth to buy his own library, but he does consult probably libraries of great figures in Rome. There are some public libraries. I don't know that we have any evidence he ever went to Alexandria per se, but he might have. And he wrote a very autistically detailed treatise on the religious rites of Egypt, on Isis and Osiris. So he's getting access to incredible treasure trove of sources, and he often tells you very explicitly who he's getting it from, and he's pretty faithful when he cites them. We can often compare. He'll cite Polybius, and there it is, and we can sometimes see how he embellishes it, and it's usually in the sense of kind of the license granted to a historian to reword a quote here or there, or invent a speech where one was implied. But he's not too um, he doesn't depart too far from his sources. He's pretty judicious, and he'll sometimes criticize, bring up, like Herodotus does, other people say this, but I think that's implausible for this and that reason. Some people say, these two people met, but the chronology doesn't work out. So he is careful. But at the same time, he'll do things like uh, look at the kind of mythological stories of, I mean, they're not mythological in the proper sense, but the life of Romulus. Most historians think that this is totally made up, not by Plutarch, but by his sources, starting in the second century. So he'll often, reproduce things that are of dubious historical quality, but often it's just because he's drawing on sources that have already done that for him. Like Lycurgus, many people doubt Lycurgus even existed. I think he probably existed, but he's probably a composite of several Spartan founders. And he will bring in things like portents and the sky was darkened before this battle. The birds were seen to fly upside down. Things like the statues were sweating. But he'll say, it was said that statues were sweating, and
Who does this, Alex? Who does this?
Plutarch does it.
Oh, Plutarch. This is Plutarch. He'll sort of
Yeah,
a bit of
yeah. But a lot of ancient historians do that, and even Caesar includes some portents in his Civil War commentary. Just to say it was said that this happened, and you don't necessarily have to say you believe it, but it adds some kind of dramatic flair to the story.
Oh yeah, I think saying statues were sweating before you say that's impressive bit of embellishment to a story to add.
Yeah.
I respect the man who does that. And is he so just to kind of some of these historians you're mentioning, I'm not sure if like everyone will know. So
Yeah. It's a
Thucydides,
mouthful.
he's pre Plutarch.
Yeah, Thucydides is the author of the Peloponnesian War.
So he's
So
writing at the time of the Peloponnesian War.
yeah,
Right.
so that would be fifth and fourth century uh, BC, and Thucydides is the guy that tells us about Pericles, about Alcibiades,
Right.
Nicias, figures that Plutarch covers. Um, for Eumenes of Cardia, it's Hieronymus of Cardia who's like totally lost. So sometimes, usually, we don't have the actual sources that he draws on, but we know about them from other references. Um, but
Right. And so the playwrights they'll be using Thucydides for some of their stories. He's pre-Greek dramatist.
so he's a rough contemporary of Euripides, and so the dramatists that we have today are mostly, I would say, pre-Thucydides or kind of earlier contemporaries of him, and they're mostly writing about mythology. Aeschylus's Persians is the famous first surviving full Greek tragedy, and that is actually one of these rare cases where a tragedian wrote about historical events.
Yeah.
The Battle of Salamis, and
And
this was generally frowned upon.
Aeschylus's
Hmm.
brother died in that battle, right?
Yes, that's right. And Aeschylus fought at the Battle of Marathon too.
Yeah.
So I mean, and Sophocles, the playwright, was a commander in the Athenian navy and commanded alongside Pericles. So these guys are all, not all of them, but I think that maybe Euripides was not a particularly political figure, but certainly Aeschylus and Sophocles are men of action that risk their lives in the defense or the colonial expansions of their country.
And just to actually, as a way of like linking that and just bring back to Plutarch, because we touched on it a little bit, but he is a Greek living under Roman rule, right?
Right.
What are the kind of political tensions? You touched a little bit on the kind of cultural tensions, and that Plutarch is trying to harmonize these two cultures, basically, which we always kind of look back and think of as the same thing, but
Hmm.
they're two entirely distinct civilizations, right? But yeah, anything you can say about the political tensions that Plutarch might have experienced?
Well, there aren't really serious factions anymore in the Roman Empire in the same way that there were in the Republic. Like in the Republic, you have the populists and the optimates, or the aristocratic party. the left and the right of Rome. And in Plutarch's day, the tension would have been between the Senate and the imperial system, which is so Augustus brings the first Roman emperor as part of transitioning from a republic to a monarchy. He starts to rely on talented men of the second class of Roman leaders like equestrians, not the senators from these grand families who always have their own agenda. They're extremely proud, but you get these equestrians in the mix who are talented, but they're not super rich. They have something to prove. They don't have these vast political networks that they can use against you. They're going to be much more loyal to you. So Augustus kind of builds out an imperial bureaucracy, as it were. You know, chief staff officers and commanders from the equestrian classes, and you start to see this in the from the beginning of the empire, that the Senate becomes more and more sidelined, and the emperors will rely on the Senate for various things, but judiciously to make sure that no power base is allowed to develop among the most influential men in Rome, and so you can kind of keep a tight rein on power. That doesn't manifest so directly into Plutarch's. I don't think it's that relevant for understanding Plutarch's politics of the Republic, when he's describing these men in the lives. He certainly does have. I mean, there's still turmoil, and people get ejected from the charmed circle of the emperor, or they get some enemies launch calumnies against them. Tacitus Agricola's a famous example of this. So he does have kind of personal political difficulties that he helps counsel some of his friends with. What to do when you get exiled. Here's what philosophy says. This does happen in his day, but they're not the same kind of political dynamics that you get in the Republic. And there are, the occasional revolts by successful generals who try to proclaim themselves emperor. And this happened in Plutarch's life. The Year of the Four Emperors was, when Nero died, there's like a quick cycle through of talented men trying to seize the throne. So that is going on for sure. But by the time Plutarch is kind of in his heyday, the Flavian emperors, Domitius, or uh, um, Vespasian, Titus, Domitius, they've pretty much locked down central politics in Rome, and it's really the period of the Pax Romana. There's not a lot of changes of power at the throne until you get into the third century.
And are they using the names of the Roman gods at home, or do they still practice? Because some of the names are interchangeable. It seems like it's Jupiter and Zeus. Are they practicing at home? I sort of wonder. It's not like if you say Jupiter at home, you suddenly have to. If you say Zeus at home, you suddenly have to sort of say, "Oh, Jupiter, Jupiter." Is it that kind of pressure on them religiously or not?
No, they're very kind of easygoing about these things. So if you're a Greek in Rome and you are telling your Greek friend, "I'll meet you at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus," you would say, "I'll meet you at the temple of Zeus." It's just the word for Jupiter in Greek. And
Right.
so Plutarch, and I think this is one of the fascinating things if you're a classical scholar, to see all the words that the Greeks use for Roman institutions. Like the consul is a strategos, is a general. The quaestor is tamias, he's a treasurer. Which tells you something about the role of the quaestor. The aedile is the agoranomos. He's the manager of the market and things like that. So you can see there's a kind of Greek translation for pretty much anything you can come up with. And I don't think I think Plutarch says pontifex, but Dionysius of Halicarnassus says Gepharopoios, which is bridge builder, which is what it means actually in Greek. So there's some kind of options that you have in dealing with these things.
Right. That's fascinating.
And is
Yeah.
that interchangeability just actually because, kind of contrary to what I said, the civilizations are actually quite similar?
Yeah, the Greeks really laid down so many of the frameworks for talking about politics in the context of collective governments. Um, the Senate, the Assembly, populists, demagogues. So many of the concepts that Plutarch describes Rome with are already kind of worked out by Greek political theorists like Aristotle and Thucydides. And because their systems are quite similar. Polybius is the best evidence for the kind of systematic functioning of the Roman Republic. Polybius is writing in the mid second century BC towards the end of the wars with Carthage. And in book 6, he describes how the Roman constitution works. And he describes it in a way that kind of continues Aristotle. He describes it as a mixed constitution, which is a concept that Aristotle talks about. There's a little bit of oligarchic here in the Senate. There's a little bit of democratic here in the popular assembly and the tribunes of the plebs. There's a little bit of the monarchic in the consuls, but it's an elected monarchy, kind of like at Sparta. So they can see so many similarities. There's obviously differences, but when a Roman goes in the second century BC to go negotiate a treaty with anyone, with Hannibal, with the Greek kings of the East, with Antiochus, they're speaking in Greek. When Scipio Africanus is about to battle with Hannibal, and they try to have a last ditch negotiation to the Battle of Zama right before the decisive battle where Scipio wins the war. They have this parley, and they both speak in Greek because they're educated political class people. A Roman and a Carthaginian, neither of them are Greeks, right? But they speak in Greek because that's the diplomatic language. And so it's very easy to kind of, and the first historians of Rome, Livius, what was it? Not Livius Andronicus. Gosh, it's Fabius Pictor. That's his name. The first Greek, the first Roman historian of Rome wrote in Greek because there's not really an audience for writing for reading history in Latin. Greek is sort of the language of literature and commerce and politics, and so I guess there's not that many literate Romans in his day, except they learn Greek if they want to learn to read anything, because anything worth reading is already in Greek.
So the first Roman historian is writing the sort of origin stories of Rome about Romulus and Remus, that sort of stuff. He's writing.
Yeah, I think Fabius Pictor is writing about, I don't know, the Samnite Wars. He might have been writing about, I can't remember. It's fragmentary, and I'd have to think back to my notes in grad school. but we don't have a lot of it. He's writing in the 3rd century BC. So, but he's doing it in Greek, very importantly.
How interesting. Shall we segue into Pericles, who is one of the characters in Plutarch? There is also a Shakespeare play called Pericles, but me and Ollie have found out that that isn't the same Pericles, right? Okay, and
I think that's right.
The Shakespeare play is a kind of romance, almost a fairy tale, like some of Shakespeare's late play.
I have to say now, it's not very good. And
it's quite, yeah.
It's the first 2 acts they think are written by someone else. I think it's someone called something Wilkes, Jonathan Wilkes. I can't remember. And
George Wilkes.
You can feel it. Who's it by, Ollie?
George Wilkes.
George Wilkes, right? And you can. It's noticeably not as good, particularly because it comes in a period where Shakespeare's still writing incredible plays. It's not like he's writing Antony and Cleopatra. He's about to write Winter's Tale and Tempest, and suddenly you've got Pericles in there, and it just feels a bit odd. And the first 2 acts, there's quite a lot of like very basic rhyming couplets that feel quite amateur compared to, and then you sort of Shakespeare. Apparently, I might be wrong here, but this is according to Harold Bloom, and in Act 3 you can sort of feel Shakespeare kind of get involved, and you can sort of suddenly the quality picks up. And anyway, so it doesn't map on to the Pericles of Plutarch in the way that me and Ollie hoped it would when we first approached you, Alex. And that aside, Pericles is this huge figure in Greek history, and he's not a name that's widely known by people outside of like the classic circles, I suppose. Could you sort of tell us about who Pericles is and who Plutarch's Pericles is, perhaps?
Yeah, Plutarch. Um, I think they're two great figures of Greek history for Plutarch who approach the ideal. One of them is his boyhood hero, Alexander the Great, and and you can see in I mean, obviously Alexander is, maybe the greatest figure from antiquity from one perspective, and you can see, I think, the gravity that Plutarch treats the subject, and that he spends a lot of time in the introduction explaining what he's doing. He doesn't do that in all the biographies. They don't all have this kind of methodological preface that tells you the philosophy of why he's doing what he's doing. Sometimes they'll just start into, they said that his father was a carpenter or whatever. But he does a similar thing in Pericles, in the uh, tells you a lot about what it is that a biography is supposed to be and why Pericles fits that picture. But who is Pericles? Briefly, Pericles is the greatest Athenian statesman. He is not just that, he is the statesman at the helm when Athens is at its greatest, which is to say, after the Persian Wars, there is, which is early 5th century BC, the Greeks at Battle of Salamis and Thermopylae, they throw off the Persian attempt to put a yoke on them. And then Athens really ramps up in power and influence. Before that, Athens was an important city, but it wasn't it wasn't the premier city. Sparta was the premier city, but it's really over the course of what happened after the Persian Wars that Athens really rises to prominence. And Pericles becomes a very influential politician in this period of Athens. Essentially, Athens rises to power by being a great naval power, which was kind of new to Athens. And they on the vote of one of their prominent statesmen, Themistocles, decided to put together a huge fleet, which was crucial in destroying the Persians' war effort. And as a result of that, building on that, they said, all right, we Greeks, we're all a bunch of disunited city-states constantly warring with each other, but clearly we have an existential threat in Persia. We have to keep the Persians at bay. Let's unite in a league to make sure that the Persians never come back. And the form that will take is we have a naval fleet and we'll just harass them, because what the fleet was crucial to the supply lines of Xerxes' army, and there's all kinds of reasons why a fleet is important in the military setup of Greece.
Is that because they're coming? Is that because the Aegean Sea, if you look at the sort of map above, the Persians will be attacking from the land above the Aegean Sea, and if they can kind of operate from those waters, they can interrupt the Persian attack.
Right. So essentially, when Xerxes comes across northern Greece, Thrace, down into Thessaly, there's not that much food for a gigantic army. There's not that much water. He drinks several rivers dry, and they're supplying their army constantly with hundreds of ships from, Phoenicia and the great wealth of grain that he's able to supply from Asia Minor. So it's so the ships are really crucial for keeping the communications lines alive, supplying that big army, and that's it was a land and sea assault, fully in both senses. So, if they don't have a navy, it's going to be very difficult for them to subdue Greece. So goes the argument, at least. Whether Xerxes was really interested in giving it another go is a different question. Maybe he wasn't that serious about Greece in the first place, but the Greeks certainly felt this existential threat, and that's what Athens leveraged to say, let's have a league, and we're the greatest naval power, so we'll lead the league, and all of the islands, you'll be in the league because you're on the front, the front lines. If the Persians attack, they're going to attack you first. And the islanders, Samos and Mytilene, all these people are like, yeah, that makes sense. But for a lot of the islands, the Athenians say, look, it's expensive to build ships. It's hard to maintain them. You guys don't have a lot of citizens. How about you just give us money? We'll assess a tribute that will cover your contribution to the league, depending on how big of an island you are. You'll fund 10 ships, but you don't have to supply the actual ships. We'll just build the ships. You just send us the money. And then, people say, okay. And so this eventually gives the Athenians an even bigger fleet and puts them in a position where they can dominate these islands. And it kind of transitions in this period from a league of, where the Athens was the first among equals to being an empire, not on accident, really. So Athens has this empire that is really at its height by the time Pericles rises to power, a couple of decades before the Peloponnesian War. And Pericles is one of the chief politicians. He's a military commander. And most famously, I think, is Pericles is responsible for the great building project of the Acropolis that, the Parthenon in its, the Elgin marbles, that was done under Pericles, the Propylaea, the famous entryway to the Acropolis that stands today. And so many of the buildings you see might have been modified in later ages, but they sort of took their grandest form in this period leading up to the Peloponnesian War, largely on the backs of all of the tribute that they were getting. So went the argument, at least, that Athens is enriching themselves by leading this league, fighting the occasional skirmish against the barbarians in Asia or Cyprus, or they have this disastrous Egyptian expedition that Thucydides describes. But Pericles is the one who persuades the Athenians to not just hold the money in trust and buy ships with it, but to build something grand with it, and to glorify Athens with the wealth of their tributaries. And this created a lot of resentment. But maybe I can read this passage. It's a famous passage from the life of Pericles where Plutarch describes this. He says, in his desire that the unwarlike throng of common laborers should neither have no share at all in the public receipts, nor yet get fees for laziness and idleness, he boldly suggested to the people projects for great constructions and designs for works which would call many arts into play and involve long periods of time, in order that the stay-at-homes, no whit less than the sailors and sentinels and soldiers, might have a pretext for getting a beneficial share of the public wealth. So Athens is the greatest city in population. They've got all of these kind of cart pushers and sausage sellers and blacksmiths and tanners and the masses, the commons. And Pericles does a kind of FDR program. Let's put these people to work. We've got all this wealth coming in. If they don't, idle hands are the devil's workshop, and he puts them all to work building the Acropolis. And Pericles is a populist in Athenian politics, even though he's an aristocrat by background. And my favorite passage of this whole biography is in this context, as Plutarch is describing the actual works of the Acropolis that Pericles constructed. And he says, let's see, for this reason are the works of Pericles all the more to be wondered at. They were created in a short time for all time. Earlier, he's describing how quickly they went up, and it's impressive that they managed to pull it off within a generation. Each of them, in its beauty, was even then and at once antique. But in the freshness of its vigor, it is, even to the present day, recent and newly wrought. And so, to me, that is the definition of a classic in a nutshell. It's born into the world already old. That is to say, archaios is ancient, in Greek is like that's the word for a classic. It's old and it's still with us, is sort of how the concept works in Greek at least. And so they're born ancient, which is true actually. If you look at the style of the sculptures in the Elgin marbles and the Acropolis, the style of architecture, it is a little bit archaic. It was intentionally designed to not be the current trend, but to hark back to something that kind of evoked the generation of your fathers or your grandfathers. So it is born with this kind of instant antiquity, and but yet it has a freshness and vigor. And in Plutarch, he's a student in Athens in his day, 500 years later, and he's seeing these things. They still have this freshness and vigor, and I think that really perfectly encapsulates. A classic is sort of born timeless and remains young as the world gets older. So I think that's just a really beautiful
Yeah,
artistic
it's
description.
incredibly inspiring to sort
Hmm.
of think of someone doing that. So he's this great statesman. He galvanizes different factions, brings them together. He builds things. He manages to kind of harness their powers and build incredible buildings in a short space of time. That's what Plutarch mentions. And,
Hmm.
and he also can win wars
Right.
there's a reference later on when he says he conquered, I think it's the Samians or
Samians, yeah, the island of Samos. Hmm.
yeah, he conquered them in 9 months, whereas Agamemnon took 10 years to conquer Troy. I like that.
Right.
So he's this sort of great, and is he just because I don't want to mix, sort of my dates aren't amazing in this area, so just try, forgive me. The he meant Plutarch is a big fan of Plato, right? He's a
Yeah.
Platonist, and he's referencing Plato with Pericles, but
Hmm.
Pericles is the statesman before Plato, right? He comes before
Right.
Plato, but it's almost like what I found kind of interesting was it's almost like when you sort of read the Republic and you think about what Plato is kind of suggesting you could do or maybe you should do to build the perfect republic, it's almost like Pericles already understood that,
Right.
and Plutarch is kind of pointing that out, is that Pericles was the kind of he was a pre-Platonist in his thinking of how you create a state. Would that be correct?
Totally. And the figure that Pericles that was sort of the Plato for Pericles was Anaxagoras, this great philosopher who is kind of his vizier, as it were. Pericles has two philosophical inspirations. One is Anaxagoras, and I think it's really interesting what he says about Anaxagoras. So Anaxagoras is famous for developing this theory of the cosmos. A lot of these early philosophers they call them physiologists, physiologoi. They're students of nature, and they're trying to give you an explanation for the kind of metaphysical coherence of the world, or otherwise. And so Anaxagoras says there's all these elements that seem to be randomly, flowing into each other, coming to be and passing away. But there is a mind, a nous, that governs the whole cosmos, which is sort of, reminiscent of the logos of Heraclitus or the Stoics or the Gospel of John. And he says Pericles is also a pupil of Zeno the Eleatic, the Zeno's paradox guy. But um, let's see if I can find this passage. Yeah, he says, the man who most consorted with Pericles, this is Anaxagoras he's talking about, and did the most to clothe him with a majestic demeanor that had more weight than any demagogue's appeals. Yes, and who lifted on high and exalted the dignity of his character was Anaxagoras of Clazomenae. And so this is something that you see in Plutarch's Life of Dion, actually, which is who is a student of Plato. Dion, another fascinating, much less known figure even than Pericles. That what a man like Dion, who is a cousin of the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse, what a man like Dionysius himself sees in philosophy, what a Pericles sees in a philosopher, what they get from them is not just like tactical insights, but a kind of magnitude of dimension that it gives you this sort of um, weightiness of character. It gives you this sense of grandeur. Aristotle would describe it as greatness of soul in the ethics, megalopsychia. And and for me, I take this to be, you see this pattern a lot with great leaders, that they are attracted to philosophers or philosophy, or they're attracted to kind of serious theology or religion, because I think that men like this are fueled by a kind of metaphysical conviction. It's not it's not so much that they are that into religion or philosophy per se, but they have this like iron uh confidence in themselves that has a lot to do with this a story that they're able to tell themselves about their role in the world. I see this in the life of Sulla, that I did on the Cost of Glory. I see it in the life of Caesar, that they have this like explanation of how what they're doing works in the whole cosmic system. And we might not be able to see exactly how they thought about it, but that's just like it's like a hunch that I have. Certainly, I think you can see it in Pericles, certainly in Dion, maybe in Alcibiades even. And certainly Julius Caesar or Sulla, they just like they believe that the gods are on their side somehow, and that's how they get to that. Philosophy is a route to that, at least for the Greeks.
Is
So
it also, as well as being that, is there any sense with Pericles that he is attempting to design or sort of improve the Athenian city-state in relation to any kind of cosmic metaphysical laws? Is he trying to like bring a kind of cosmic order onto Earth or express it architecturally, culturally?
yeah, I haven't really thought about that, but it deserves investigation. I suspect that Plutarch would like to believe that. Plato is kind of critical of Pericles in the Gorgias, as a kind of demagogic figure. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that he is, it could be the context really that, he associates Pericles with other kind of demagogic figures, because Pericles was very good at kind of manipulating the people. But if you see it anywhere, you see it in the Acropolis, don't you? Like
Hmm.
the highest aspirations of mankind aesthetically, cosmically, it's like reaching towards the sky. And and truly Athens was, despite the fact that you couldn't see it in Pericles' day, that the democratic constitution was the worst of all constitutions from the perspective of Plato, with the benefit of hindsight, because Athens loses the war, partly because of ways that you can very easily trace to the fact that they had a bad constitution. They chased out their good leaders. They were inconsistent in their foreign policy because of the way that their constitution was set up. But uh, at least in Pericles' time, they were able to mobilize the greatest number of men, um, in their land armies, but also in their ships. They're just like able to actuate the greatest quantity of talent in their
Right.
city,
Right.
because they don't have this helot population like the Spartans have, these kind of serfs, slaves. And of course, the Athenians have slaves, but nothing to the scale that Sparta has. And I think that a lot of it has to do with people's buy-in to the system, which democracy is really good at getting people to buy into the system.
Mm.
So, yeah, one could just keep riffing, but I'd like to investigate that further.
Can I ask sort of a potentially very stupid question, but that my modern brain always finds difficulty in understanding? But these are city-states in what we
Mhm.
now know as the country called Greece, right?
Right,
Uh, they did not think of a country called Greece, right?
right.
But they thought of themselves as Greek.
Hmm.
How does that work? I can never fully understand.
Well, it's a I've heard it described as, Greece. The Greek is a not a political tradition, but a cultural technology. To be a Greek is to speak the same language, to be a devotee of Homer, to have the same gods and the same heroes, and And there never was a Greek political unity that encompassed the majority of them until maybe, the forcible, violent, subduing of the Greeks by Philip of Macedon and then his son Alexander the Great. So it is a really unique feature of I think the power and the instability of the Greek political world, that they do not like to be ruled, whether by Greeks or by barbarians. And so they have the sense of the independent city-states and a kind of cultural unity of a people which matters a lot. When Greeks fight Greeks, the rules are different. When Greeks fight barbarians, it's no holds barred. But when Greeks fight Greeks, it's more gentlemanly. Like,
Right.
You don't want to just slaughter all your enemies because you might have to do a deal with them the next year. There's something more civilized. They're kind of our people, even though we had a fight. You can make up in a way. And of course, the Greeks are also often Sicily. They're in southern Italy. They're in southern France, Gibraltar. To say nothing of Cyprus and Cyrene and Libya. They're all over the Mediterranean, right? And they're participating. What it means to be a Greek for a lot of them is to have access to the Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries and games, that you have the right to ask the god Delphi a question, that you have the right to enter into the Olympic Games, that you have the right to participate in the Eleusinian mysteries. So there is a kind of cultural, and I'd say ultimately fundamentally religious unity, a metaphysical unity. That's not about orthodoxy, but there is a sense of like being in communion with the other Greeks, right? That you can actually participate in the rites. Like that's, Fustel de Coulanges talks about this in the Ancient City. It's very important.
Mm-hmm. And anthropologically, were they a unified people before splitting off into these city-states?
Yeah, then you get into kind of theories of the Dorian invasion and the Indo-European break-off tribes, and if they were, I mean, look at the Mycenaean Greeks. We don't know a lot about them. We don't have literary sources. We have archaeology and temple records of how many cows were sacrificed on this day and this sort of thing. Even then, these Pylos, Mycenae, they seem to be in this kind of city-state model ruled by kings, with independent territories. It's just there's not like the political technology for making a grand empire. Maybe there's a subordinate relationship. I mean, the Spartans have some kind of dominion over the whole peninsula of the Peloponnese, but it's a dominion over other free city-states in much of the Peloponnese. They have their kind of slave class helots, but they also have like Elis and Corinth and well, not Argos because they hate the Argives, but there are a lot of these independent city-states that are notionally independent, but also kind of look to Sparta as leaders of a league. So, but it's hard to really have a centralized state in antiquity with the communications and bad roads and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
So during Pericles' reign, how long did he rule for?
Well, he dies, I think, in 427, a couple of years into the Peloponnesian War that he kind of put the Athenians up to. He's like, the Spartans challenge them with their, list of their injustices, and he says, "All right, fight us," and manages to persuade the Athenians to go to war, and then he dies in the plague. So his heyday is like 460, really 450, I think. I'm trying to remember when the Samos revolts that he put down was. I think this is around the 450s. My history of that period is a little hazy, but essentially 25 years or 30 years. And as Thucydides says, Athens was a democracy in constitution, but in fact was under the sway of one preeminent man, which was Pericles. And that was why Athens was actually good as a democracy. A democracy for Thucydides is basically a bad constitution. But when you have a guy like Pericles at the top of it, it can actually work. And he can bring out the greatness that the demagogues would squander.
Yeah. I mean, you do sort of wonder what what democracy even is. Sometimes it just feels like it's just different. It's a different form of making people think something else, but actually power is power and leaders
Mhm.
lead by
Mhm.
whatever means you need to do it with. The So he is just with the Greek playwrights, just to kind of tie it into sort of mine and Ollie's sphere of like the history of theatre and acting. And is Pericles the kind of is he the, would is that the period of the great playwrights? I know they sort of stretch from Aeschylus to
Yeah.
Aristophanes.
Hmm.
Is that right? And there's lots that are being lost. I noticed quite a few references to Cratinus or
Hmm.
Cratinus that
Plotinus,
I'd never
yeah.
heard of this guy, and he was one of the famous. He wrote like 100 plays, but I don't think we have much of his work now. Is that correct?
No, no complete plays from any of them except for Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. Also, Menander is we have one or two complete plays. I think it's just one mostly complete play,
Right.
who's very popular in the Roman period. And a lot of the Roman comedies are direct translations of Menander with little changes. But no, those are the greats for the Greeks, and we have droves and droves of little fragments and quotes preserved in other authors from guys like Cratinus. There's a Plato Comicus, a different Plato, unrelated, who was a comic playwright. We have Phrynichus, fragments maybe of Phrynichus, who's another tragic playwright. But yeah, but Pericles was really alive during pretty much the heyday of Greek tragedy. Um, at least for a guy like Nietzsche, Sophocles is the pinnacle. Euripides is this kind of demotic bourgeois degeneration of the aristocratic Sophocles and Aeschylus. But that's really in Pericles' time,
Do we
Yeah.
know
more or
whether
less.
Pericles had any interest in theatre or whether any of his cultural projects were theatre related?
I haven't done a deep dive on Pericles on the Cost of Glory yet. I will soon, so it's a little hazy for me right now. But I mean, he would have attended for sure in the
Mm.
front row seats. He's there. When these comic poets are making fun of him for being Squillhead and calling him, all of these names, he's sitting there listening, right? It's a very public uh, kind of farcical, jesting, roasting. So, um, well, in the funeral oration, famously, that Thucydides is the source for in the book two of the Peloponnesian War, and Thucydides wrote it, but he said something like Pericles would have said about the greatness of Athens. He talks about Athens being the school of Hellas, um, and contrast with the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, who are very secretive and they chase away their foreigners periodically. Athens has just open doors and you can come and learn philosophy there. When he says though, the school of Hellas, he really is talking about the theater above all. The tragic poets were called didaskaloi. They were called teachers, which is specifically referring to their role of teaching the youths to sing in the chorus, teaching the actors the lines. But they're also seen in very obviously in Plato's Republic as public educators. And so I think, at least from the perspective of the funeral oration, he's drawing on this fact that, the cultural power of Athens is one of its huge advantages in the war effort with Sparta. They have such an advantage in terms of propaganda and kind of the soft power that they're able to wield through inviting the allied states to come and see the greatest shows on earth. That is definitely part of the soft power machine of Athens, funded in part surely by the hard power machine of Athens, because these things are expensive to run and fund and sacrifice all the cows you need to feed everybody if you're going to feed everybody. So
There's a brilliant bit in Plutarch about Pericles' skill in rhetoric. He says for their arising and growing up, as was natural, all manner of distempered feelings among a people which had so vast a command and dominion. He alone, as a great master, knowing how to handle and deal fitly with each of them, and, in an especial manner, making that use of hopes and fears, as his two chief rudders, with the one to check the career of their confidence at any time, with the other to raise them up and cheer them when under any discouragement, plainly showed by this that rhetoric, or the art of speaking, is, in Plato's language, the government of the souls of men, and that her chief business is to address the affections and passions, which are, as it were, the strings and keys to the soul, and require a skilful and careful touch to be played on as they should be. Which I thought was a brilliant passage
Yeah.
in how to rule because you can build all these wonderful buildings, and that's, a great rule, a great leader should, and you can win
Hmm.
wars as you have to, and you have to govern the souls of men. And
Hmm.
I thought that was very striking. And again, I know one of the things you seem to be doing, Alex, is to kind of encouraging the new leaders in our world,
Hmm.
learning from the ancients to kind of inspire leaders and thinkers in the world we find ourselves in. And one has to understand how to govern the souls of men in order to do that. And Plutarch recognizes this about Pericles. I thought it was just a lovely passage.
Yeah, he plays them like an instrument. It's brilliant. And it's interesting. I would tie this into the way that he describes Pericles as educators in the early part of the biography. I think Damon is one of the guys that is his teacher in music, is at least in my translation. He's in the Greek word there is musike, which is you might think that he's just his violin teacher, but in Greek the the education of the traditional education is an education in musike, which is the art of the muses, which is not just music and dance. It's also memorizing poetry and rhetoric and there's rhythm, but the the rhetorical education and actually Plutarch explicitly says this that his music teacher was actually kind of a sophist in the best sense. He's a professional teacher of oratory and not just a teacher of like memorizing poetry and learning to perform in the tragic games, the choruses, which are such an important part of Greek culture. But um, a training in music is designed to kind of help you do that. That a literary education is designed to give the leader the tools that he needs to play the people like an instrument, to bring out the fear and the hope and the anger and the love and as the moment requires. So this is very much in the line of the what Greeks think the best version of a an education in the sort of thing that you would pick up from studying tragedy or performing in tragedy,
Yeah.
what it's supposed to give you. And Pericles did it the best, I think, for Plutarch, which is one of the reasons why he's one of the greatest statesmen.
Yeah. Sorry to muddy the discussion here. I feel like I'm lowering us, pulling us down to somewhere not very nice. But well, depending, Tony Blair is the last person I can remember in this country who did have a skill at governing the souls of men, right, and women.
Yeah.
And he
Hmm.
he sort of spoke the country we live in into existence. And he
Hmm.
was incredibly convincing and powerful at doing that. And so much so that me and Ollie always talk about this, is that our world, much of our world, it's obviously changing a lot now, but is still kind of governed and ran by people who effectively are in Tony Blair's mind. They're like he's
Hmm.
spoken them into their way of seeing the world, and they cannot even unsee it. They don't know any other way of thinking because this guy told them who they were. And yeah, that's which is, in some ways he deserves some kind of credit for because it's very impressive.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's very it's Pericles like maybe it's Alcibiades like maybe, Alcibiades is Pericles' nephew, I think, and
Oh,
was and strove to kind of outdo Pericles and was went what further down, even though from an aristocratic family like Pericles, he goes further down that populist um, channel. And what Plutarch and Plato and many would criticize him for is essentially uh, using his populist powers not ultimately to the greatness of Athens, but to the greatness of himself. And that you can debate that. I think it's hard to. I think you can see that in both on from both angles with Alcibiades. But the demagogic art is the most powerful and good in the service of the state, but it's also the most dangerous when it twists it in a direction that is ultimately not good for the state. That's why philosophy is so important in understanding true statesmanship. I do think that it's harder to do that to people if they have a really strong sense of their history and
Yeah.
other models for thinking about what a state and a people should be, which is one of the things that I think that you get from studying the classics. It's kind of, especially for the leadership of a nation, it's like an anchor point, like it makes it harder to deceive you, perhaps.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One hopes.
Would someone like Plutarch then, if one state were being dragged in an undesirable direction by a charismatic leader, is the solution to learn the arts of rhetoric in order to combat that? Not just the arts of rhetoric, but essentially just offer a better vision as a sort of contrary statesman to that. Do you know what I mean?
Well, it's like Aristotle says in the Rhetoric, truth and goodness are superior by nature. And so if they lose in the public discourse, it is to their own advocates that we should ascribe the blame, who should have had the responsibility to make the better case for what is actually better. So absolutely. Uh, and Plutarch's a great product of the rhetorical education system, the storytelling, the research, the kind of emphasis on character and his ability to see both sides. He'll portray Pompey very sympathetically. He'll portray Caesar very sympathetically. He'll portray Cato very sympathetically. I mean, all these men were mortal enemies at various points, and seeing both sides of the picture just gives you this power, I think, to be able to make the case for your opponent better than he could make it for himself is key to being able to actually defeat him in
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
contest.
Yeah, but it's
And
it's not it's not just rhetoric though, is it? It's like if you look at Plato's
Hmm.
the Republic, it's like the music, right? And,
Hmm.
think about this, the sounds that people listen to, the kind of rhythms that people listen to, the gods they have, right? All these if you want to kind of control and rule and lead, you have to consider all of these things on a fundamental level. And if you think of like once again, you think of like Tony Blair. I'm sorry to keep using him in the Plutarch discussion. Something feels wrong about it, but there was a kind of soundtrack that came along with him in some ways. We had like Things Can Only Get Better, and you had Oasis, and so it's many things going on at the same time to rule, right? To be a great ruler, you have to kind of yeah. It's a lot going. Yeah,
I want to ask you guys, like, I've kind of presented what I think Plutarch is about, and I find the idea that Shakespeare has, his own kind of not maybe a political agenda, but like a moral agenda. There's something about Shakespeare that really evokes that sense of emulation for greatness, I think, for me at least. And how do you see the two, even though they're very distinct, and she's a dramatist and he's a biographer, like what do you see the overlaps between Shakespeare and Plutarch potentially?
that's a very, very, very good question. I'm not sure about the purpose of their work. It's always very murky territory to get into the purpose of Shakespeare's plays, whereas Plutarch seems to talk about that quite a lot. As you said, the
Right.
opening, the Pericles chapter is like an explanation of what I'm doing, and I mean, there's certainly a similarity in this interest in like what is a character,
Hmm.
what makes up someone's character. Do people have characters? I feel like Shakespeare is kind of experimenting with that sometimes. and I can see reading, I can sort of imagine him reading it and like finding these little specific details that Plutarch gives so beautifully, and just like
Hmm.
seizing on those and going, oh, that's wonderful. He's brilliant at those small details.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that Shakespeare does have uh, a moral compass, definitely. He seems to like to resolve around family and harmony. He's interested in that. He's interested in forgiveness. In some ways, I think we can say he's fairly conservative, even though most
Hmm.
of my university education was designed to make him not conservative, make him a sort of proto-liberal. But
Hmm.
I feel confident in saying that he has quite a conservative outlook. We know from his own personal life that he was quite conservative. But I don't know. But what plays would you?
It's a tricky one, Oz, because I feel that when this is the problem with this, with like you said at the beginning of what you just said there, when you try and say what the purpose of Shakespeare is, even what his moral compass is, you end up just tying yourself in knots, right? Because he is so elusive in those areas, and all the different plays you read of Shakespeare, you never quite know what if there is some sort of authorial kind of encouragement in one way. If he's there's a line in an Edmund speech. I've got my complete works here. And Edmund in King Lear says, "Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services abound." And I feel like, in a way, that's quite a good line to think about who Shakespeare might be. Is that his services abound to nature and all of it. Like it's not it and it's the complexity of human life, or the complexity of all of us. And so just when you think something is this, there's something else will coming which will prove it's not as straightforward as that. Or and you see the theme of power in Shakespeare again and again, and the sort of holding power, losing power. How do you hold power? What do you do with power? What is power? Does it control you? Is it something outside you try and get in? Uh, but it does become very hard to say what's going on here with, so what exactly what does he want from us? And does he want anything from us? It's hard. In some ways, he feels quite, at times, I have to say, Shakespeare feels quite nihilistic.
Hmm.
I mean, Henry V is a good example, it seems to me, of him presenting an ideal leader. Um,
Hmm.
Yes.
but But beyond that, I mean, I've always just put this down to the difference in form. He's working in the dramatic form. He wants to have characters stepping over, transgressing all the time, going too far, following mad impulses because they're dramatically exciting, right? But as Morgan says, he's extremely elusive. Um, did you have, so you, I mean, you said there, Alex, that you felt that he was offering up examples to us. Did you have any specific plays in mind?
Well, I think of Coriolanus, and I think that which he's taking
Hmm.
directly out of Plutarch, a lot of his plot points. But you know, he's able to give you an admiration for the grandeur of the man, and also see exactly why he fails. Why Coriolanus just can't help himself but to alienate the people because he's so aristocratic. Uh, and I think that but there's the tribunes are never these kind of soulless bad guys. They have legitimate claims, and Coriolanus's enemies, and so I suppose from the perspective of training in statesmanship, at least,
Mm.
if
Yep.
if he had if he had any kind of concession to idealism over realism, it would be a disservice to the person trying to navigate the complexities of politics, which are very often quite nihilistic. And if
Mm.
you can't go there and know that that might be motivating things, then you're going to be ill-equipped,
Yeah.
as Machiavelli would point out, be the first. So I don't know.
And
I
Julius
think that
Caesar would be a great example of a play that teaches you about power and
right,
factionalism, betrayal, how power
right,
actually works, right?
right. And what was I going to say? Well, I'll come. Well, this is something that Aristotle talks about in the Poetics, that tragedy is about great figures, that there has to be something admirable and praiseworthy, even in even in if the character is ultimately responsible for their own demise. There's something that you like in them or that you want to have from them, that is on the plane of ethics and morals, even though they might end up being despicable in the end. But if they're outright despicable, then you're not going to cry when they destroy
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
And the point of tragedy is to have that experience of. I think this goes to the anthropology of story too, that we look to. We like to see people suffer and hopefully come out of it. But even if they don't, we find that suffering useful for our own experience if we can see ourselves in them. And if it's just a pure villainy, or if it's total randomness of, just a boulder falling on a good man for no reason,
Mm.
we're not going to have that emotional connection, which is really what tragedy serves as like a good, both not just for emotional readjustment, but to kind of pull us toward the better version of ourselves and help us to get through our own trials.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder if Alcibiades might be too much of a mountain to climb for the time we have now, and we could maybe focus on Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Because I think it's probably more useful to kind of partner this with Pericles, and then we can kind of carry this discussion on here. Because so Alex, when I first, just to kind of give my sort of background with you, I was reading a biography of Shakespeare, and Plutarch popped up a lot, right? This character, and as I was reading the book, I became fascinated by who Shakespeare was, and that's very very difficult to fully understand. Right? We have all these plays, we don't know so much about his life. We've got these records here and there of people referencing him, but very not much on him. And so I was trying to work out who he was as a writer. I was thinking, who is this man? Like, what's he reading? What's inspiring him? What kind of education has he got? And Ovid, Ovid's Metamorphosis was one of the ones that
Hmm.
come up, and then Plutarch, and the other his English history is through Hollinshead's Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which I do also want to geek out on at some point. We've got enough to go with Plutarch for now. But so Plutarch would come up a lot, and I thought, who's this guy, Plutarch, that the Shakespeare's reading? And then I heard you on some podcasts, and you were giving these brilliant kind of talks on Plutarch, and so yes, that was when I became really fascinated by what you were doing. And then someone mentioned it, and we got so lucky to be here with you. And so I think what I'm kind of where I'm driving this towards is that Shakespeare is so inspired by his readings of Plutarch. I would say more so than the Iliad and the Odyssey, possibly,
Hmm.
right? Because he I think he would have read those because Troilus and Cressida, he's using lots of the stories and characters from the Trojan War. So presume he would have had access to those, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and
Hmm.
Odysseus is in it. But Plutarch actually is more of an inspiration to him, I'd say, because there's all these characters. You've got Julius Caesar, lots of characters from Julius Caesar are in Plutarch's lives. And then we have Alcibiades, who pops up in, is it Timon of Athens, Oz, is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so effectively what I'm kind of getting at here, and I've heard you say this on other podcasts, is that there was a point at one point in time where you'd read, not only would people be encouraged to read the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Plutarch's lives would be kind of on the curriculum, something you should read to understand the world and your past and who you could be. And now we don't have basically any of this, right? We don't even really have the Iliad and the Odyssey, to be honest. Like, we're going to have Christopher Nolan's film in a few years, but it's probably
Hmm.
not going to be. We should read the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? So Plutarch is this incredible figure that you, in your brilliant work, have kind of reintroduced to a more general public at large, because I suppose in the classics world they probably know quite a lot about him. But yeah, so I just wanted to sort of set this up as a discussion. Plutarch being this character that people would have studied in history, and when did they stop studying him? And yeah, maybe Shakespeare's relationship with Plutarch, and just we could maybe riff on that, I thought.
Yeah, well, Emerson puts it well, and Emerson, on my side of the pond, of course, was a great essayist a, a great emulator of Plutarch. He really took Plutarch as one of his guides, not just as a resource, but as a kind of model for what an author could be. And many of his references to antiquity are drawn straight from Plutarch. And there's a great introduction to an edition of Plutarch's Lives that Emerson wrote that I'd highly recommend. If you Google Emerson on Plutarch, and he'll talk about Plutarch's virtues, and he talks about things like how Plutarch is so resilient to translation. His charm comes through in multiple different translations. It kind of carries well. But one of the things that he says is, Plutarch is the kind of, I'm paraphrasing here heavily, but he's the gateway to antiquity for most people of Emerson's day. He says, ironically, in our day, even though Thucydides might be the greater historian, for every one reader of Thucydides, there are 100 readers of Plutarch. I think that's maybe switched today, oddly enough, but and that Thucydides probably owes that one reader to somebody who started off with Plutarch. And so Plutarch has been, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a great example of this. Plutarch has been the kind of boyhood introduction to antiquity for generations and generations of Western leaders and writers. And Rousseau talks about how I think he encountered Plutarch at age 9 and was just filled with the spirit of Republican liberty, thrusting his hand into a hot chafer, like Scaevola. But I think that he's been that figure because he's so accessible and because biography really gets you into a historical period like none other. You have to have an emotional connection to key people. Most people need that, at least, to really get into history and to really understand the drama of what's at stake and to want to research it deeply. And it's one thing to study the political system of a society that you've never experienced, but when you can actually relate to the characters, it just adds so much more meaning to it. And I think that this is essentially what history is for. Nietzsche talks about this, in the uses and abuses of history, that history is above all for people of action to look to the past, not to understand every fact in detail, but to see themselves in it and to imagine what they can achieve and to be informed by the company of the men they want to be like in the present day. And Plutarch really encapsulates that. In that same essay, he says, to the young men of his day, satisfy your souls on Plutarch and dare to believe in yourselves when you believe in his heroes. 100 men educated thus who have become ripe through this process of encountering Plutarch could silence now forever the noisy pseudo education of their day. So
Yeah, that's a great quote. I'd heard that quote and I was hoping you would. It's absolutely fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's brilliant, and he's fighting against essentially the force that sidelined Plutarch in the curriculum. Funny enough, and I don't think this was deliberate necessarily, but the rise of the German university model, which was exported right around the time that Nietzsche was writing that essay in the 1870s, is being exported at an industrial scale to America, to creating places like Johns Hopkins and the land grant universities and the research universities. The transformation of the American college system, which are more on the Oxford Cambridge model, which kind of for the humanities at least, they're looking in this Renaissance tradition of crafting statesmen and shaping character, learning rhetoric, learning to emulate, and and desire greatness. They're kind of moving from that model in America at the time, and they're certainly doing that in Germany, to a more kind of like the Enlightenment model of the university, which is knowledge production, expert production, which kind of ends up being bureaucrat production from Nietzsche's perspective.
Wow.
And it's that transition to seeing history as a science that is ultimately about, was ist eigentlich gewesen, what really happened. Really, history is about the facts and not about this nonsense of character and emulation. Oh, that's a distorting mirror. To see history as a mirror is to do violence to it. That's what a prominent academic historian of Nietzsche's day would say. And Nietzsche would say, exactly. You have to do violence to history. We have always done violence to history because the point is not to worship the past. It's to create the present and the future. It's to inspire us now. It's for the sake of life. And so Plutarch kind of became sidelined for these reasons. I think, the curriculum kind of over the course of, at least in America, and I couldn't speak so well to the British situation, but the classics curriculum came to be, well, first of all, there was this odd separation of philosophy and literature, where the classics departments took over the literature, and then the philosophy departments just started analyzing arguments and Plato. And I think just separating those two things was really pernicious for at least for this Renaissance spirit of classics as kind of forming people into greatness. But there's also this tendency when classicists just see their remit as like fiction on the one hand and historical scientific truth on the other hand. These two poles of classics are kind of like scientific ancient history and free for all literary criticism that follows the whims of the day. There's no place that this monumental model of history, the emulation of greatness, the Shakespearean approach to Plutarch, the Machiavellian approach to Plutarch, the Rousseauian approach, the Alexander Hamilton to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson approach to Plutarch, the Ben Franklin approach to Plutarch, the Emerson approach to Plutarch. There's no slot that falls into, and it's seen as passé by the literary people, unhistorical by the historical people, and certainly like not even on their radar for the philosophers, who are, at least in the analytic tradition, are much more about kind of looking at metaphysical arguments or ethical, whatever the case may be, but not like applying philosophy through narrative, which is what Plutarch is really about.
Mm.
So that's a kind of a long-winded tirade, but
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic.
fascinating. Amazing.
that's how I see it all working out, and that's how I see Plutarch being sidelined by cultural forces, maybe deliberately, maybe subconsciously, and now he's just barely read, and I'm, we have work to do to bring him back, because as you know, he's so great and charming and so easy to get into relative to a lot of the other classical authors.
Yeah.
It's fascinating just what you're saying about education. Like you're talking about the separation of philosophy and literature, and that's kind of what me and Morgan are doing with a lot of what we do at the base.
Mm-hmm.
Theatre, dramaturgy has been separated from everything else. Like and the idea of introducing like philosophy into plays is just considered so sort of weird, or the people involved with it haven't been kind of trained enough in that way to even be capable of that, which I think is a great loss. And a lot of what you've been saying about education, a kind of rounded education in classics and rhetoric and philosophy, with the idea of it making you a statesman, or even just with the idea of that education aligning you with truth and
Mm-hmm.
beauty, is something that feels so lost. And as someone who went through the British university system studying English, there was this a kind of weird remnant of it that maybe studying English could make you a better person because you could see other people's point of view when you read a novel. But that was the extent of it. And this is perfectly encapsulated if anyone wants to watch or listen to David Foster Wallace's commencement speech, This is Water or something like that, which was very
Right.
popular with like English grad millennial generation, and it just says that like you could be, you've had a terrible day at work and you're driving in your car and you get really angry with the person in another car, but then you read a novel and you realize, oh, that's another human being as well. So that was the extent of the sort of moral ambitions of the education that I had, and it's just so refreshing to hear. Oh no, it can actually make actually is supposed to align you with truth and beauty
Hmm.
and action in the world.
Action, you should
Hmm.
smash his car and then take the metal and build a statue
The
of
pirate
Yes.
yourself.
spirit. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so this is a great applying philosophy through narrative and perfectly kind of maps onto what me and Ollie are trying to do. So we did the performances of like we did Prometheus Bound as our first one, and then we had a
Oh,
philosopher immediately afterwards getting up and talking about who Prometheus was, who he might be, what does this myth mean, and trying to kind of get people back into these bigger discussions and the magic of it all, really. It's absolutely inspiring and enchanting and lifts your soul and all of this good stuff, right? And yeah, that's this is it. So this is great. So good to
well,
talk about this,
I
Alex.
think you guys are nailing it. I'm really thrilled to see where it goes, because this people really want this. It really works, actually. It's great entertainment, and people don't mind having some uh some discussion of morals. I mean, people are freaking moralistic, like today more than ever. And I think that they crave to see that higher purpose to their entertainment consumption, which, you know, is just all over the ancient sources, like to that you can bring it into, it's not pure entertainment. It points you, it forms you in a certain way. It aligns you with, serious projects in life, whether it's the ambition to be a statesman or a business leader or just a great dad or whatever it is. Like it and it does it in these very concrete ways that are about much more than just kind of seeing other people's perspectives and having some quiet time. There's a tradition there that it's very rich, and I think the more you dig, you're going to find further confirmation of your biases,
Yeah,
which are all
yeah,
leaning in
yeah.
the right direction.
Yeah, it's deeply enriching. Can I just ask one more question then
Yeah.
about from Alex's recommendation? So this is kind of not become like the question of the show, but something along the lines of something like this, right? We've obviously got Plutarch to be reading, and all of us must get busy reading our Plutarch, okay? Is there a book outside of Plutarch, perhaps, that you might, a mind-blowing book that you might recommend us, some sort of kind of life-changing book that you can think of?
Hmm. Well, I'll say the first thing that comes to mind
Yeah.
that is a modern book that I don't know if everybody's gonna like it, but so I just had a baby and we're sleep deprived and staying up in weird hours reading whatever I can get my hands on. And I just read the um, On the Marble Cliffs by Ernst Jünger. And he's the guy who wrote Storm of Steel, a German kind of conservative writer.
Yeah.
Uh, I recommend the recent translation that was done. Uh, can't find it on my shelf. It's short, but uh, you might not get it on the first pass. There's a lot of kind of veiled historical references, but it's a beautiful description of, I think, ideals and what happens when they collapse and how to revive them. And I don't want to spoil it, but it hit me very hard
Oh,
as I was, giving a bottle to my 1 week old baby that like this man understood. And he's writing on the eve of World War II. Um, and there are some interesting, and he's German, so he's like seeing what's happening in Germany. He's also seeing what's happening in the USSR at the time. So the historical background is like relevant, but it's not in your face. It's not like an allegory Romana Clef. It's
yeah.
about I think it's a real contemplative study of what greatness actually consists in and it's not all war and politics. It's from the perspective of a kind of ascetic, it's kind of scholar, warrior, poet. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to spoil it, but it just came to mind, and it seemed like a really important work for our times. So short, 130 pages or so.
Perfect.
Absolutely perfect. Can I just get the title again? On the Marble Hills.
On the Marble Cliffs.
Cliffs, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, by
I,
Ernst Jünger.
Ernst Jünger, yeah, great. I started to read Storm of Steel
Yeah.
and sort of World War One. Yeah, I remember there was a really kind of moving bit at the beginning of that when he talks about how much he respects the English soldiers and how strong they
Hmm.
are, how brave they are, and incredible they are. I just found that very sort of moving, actually. But I'm leaving that to come back to at some point because I feel like at some point I'm going to geek out about World War One, and I'll have that as mine. At the moment, I'm very deep into World War Two stuff, so I've got back to that.
I too got
Fantastic.
bogged down with Storm of Steel, and so I kind of said come to Jünger later, and then somebody said you should check out On the Marble Cliffs, and it's a very standalone. It's fiction, so
Mm.
you can just
Well, on the
go right
Sounds
in.
brilliant.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm just looking him up. He lived to 102.
incredible. Yeah. Oh, my camera went out. Let me switch it here. Yeah, he ended up ugh, how about that? Um,
Even more books.
Converting to Catholicism. Yes. It's the shelf goes on and
We
on.
thought you were that clever. Now we realize you're even smarter.
It just scratched the surface.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He became
100.
a Catholic convert later in life. So from
That's
being a kind of, yeah, anyway, fascinating biography too of the man for sure. Great
Fantastic.
author.
Do you, maybe very, very final quick question. Do you have a favorite play?
Hmm. My favorite play from the Greeks is, you know, Nietzsche's taught me to be suspicious of and despise Euripides, but I still just I get so much mileage out of the Bacchae,
Mm.
the Bacchic women. It's I I I see myself in multiple characters in that story, which is which is I think the point. So
Mm.
it's to me it's inexhaustible.
Mm. Mm.
Fantastic.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Brilliant.
So, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you guys. It's been quite a pleasure, and I hope to come back and hope to visit your show in London sometime.
Yeah, yeah, come and see us.
Wonderful.
And thank you. Your podcast is so amazing. And please, can any of our listeners in the UK or anywhere you're listening, follow Alex's work and the Cost of Glory podcast. And Alex, is there anywhere else you'd like to send people, or we could send people to follow what you're doing?
Yeah, if you go to costofglory.com, it'll tell you about some of our rhetoric programs and retreats. We're trying to build out a real education for people that they might not have gotten in school. I certainly didn't get until I did a lot of work on my own in the greats. So yeah, costofglory.com kind of has the summary of most of what I'm up to.
Bless you.
Thank you so much, Alex.
So we are, yeah, I'll just like sort of outro out. We are the base. Thank you very much for listening. If you're listening to this, you've probably seen or hopefully seen the Agon 2 last week in London. So we're recording this the day before our new writing competition. But yeah, please follow our work and follow what we do. And yeah, come on this journey with us. And we're trying to learn more and re-inspire and reinvigorate the dramatic arts in all the ways that we can. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And thank you, Alex, very much for joining.
Cheers.